Namaskar. I, on behalf of Bharatiya Itihas Sankalan Samiti, Karimganj district, welcome you all in our Facebook live session. Today we have with us renowned educationist Professor Amlandeep Das, who is the former HOD of Department of English, Cotton University. Sir represented Assam state in cricket and is also an enthusiastic tennis player. He translated poems of Hiren Bhattacharya and Navakanta Borua as well. Sir, the topic which you selected is the influence of the Upanishads on TS Eliot's magnum opus, The Wasteland. Sir, you can start now.
Okay, namaskar viewers, and a very good evening to all of you. At the very outset, I would like to thank the Bharatiya Itihas Sankalan Samiti, Karimganj district, and especially to Dr. Nilanjan Dey for giving me this honor to speak about a topic that has tremendous socio-political relevance during the present times. And I would like to start my talk now. It's about T.S. Eliot's magnum opus, The Wasteland, and how he was influenced to a great extent by the Upanishads, the Hindu philosophy, and Buddhist and Jain philosophy as well. One among the many scholars who were influenced, one of the Western philosophers and scholars who was influenced by Indian philosophy, Indian mythology, and that is T.S. Eliot, the Nobel laureate in literature. He got a Nobel Prize in 1942. And a cursory inquest into his works, and especially The Wasteland, we can make out that he took refuge to a great extent in the Upanishads while composing his magnum opus, that is The Wasteland. Now, the dominant poetic voice of the 1920s, if you look at the Western culture, used to be an essential his voice is that of an essential elliptical one that put across the view that modern Western civilization had become sterile and decadent. So the Wasteland that he wrote in 1922 is a poem in which he employs literary and cultural allusions from Buddhism and the Hindu Upanishads. So Eliot became a very prominent poet in the aftermath of the chaos and convulsions of the First World War, and what sparked his interest in Vedic thought is not really recorded as such in the historical books, but it is known that he was very much occupied, very much interested in Sanskrit, then Pali, and the metaphysics of Patanjali. And by 1942, Eliot was in exile. A loneliness of selfhood, and it was the Bhagavad Gita with its metaphysical wisdom that gave Eliot a ray of hope and a super sensible state of, what we can call the self-satiating realization. Now, when the Wasteland was published, a renowned Western critic called it, this is very important, he called it a Hindu puzzle. And despite the fact that Krishna as a character does not show up in the poem, Yet we may say that the influence of the Gita is undeniable, as is the direct use of the Upanishads. Now, I would like to concentrate on, because The Wasteland is a huge poem, it's really huge. So I would like to emphasize or talk or focus on two important sections of this poem. The first one is the fire sermon, and the second one is called the death by water. These two sections of the wasteland actually zeroes in on Hindu philosophy, and essentially the Upanishads deal with creation and death, while the Gita tells one how one can conduct his life, or how to live life, or how to approach life in a more sensible manner. And one thing we have to keep in mind is that Eliot draws upon the troubles, from his own life, especially his turbulent marriage to Vivian. And to overcome his troubles, he seeks the teachings of the Upanishads. Now, the first section that I would like to emphasize on or focus on is the fire sermon. And the other section, that is death by water, are really, really heavily rooted in Hindu philosophy and contain both the problems and the solutions that one may encounter in today's world. Now, in the first section, that is the fire sermon, Eliot condemns the fires of, physical passion, and salvation involves overcoming the lust of the flesh. This is what he is trying to emphasize actually in a very symbolic manner. And it is suggested that sex and religion are rival modes of unity, the two sides of the same coin, maybe. And there's a character called the typists, and the constant efforts of the typist in trying to attain some pleasure, physical pleasure, shows that she feels something but cannot really get true joy, because her whole approach, her way of thinking, her mode is wrong, totally wrong, as she relies too much on the senses, on the physical senses. And this typist's character is actually based on Eliot's own wife, Vivian, who actually appears to be the inspiration behind the typist's character. And Eliot somewhere else has referred to the Gita as far as the typist's character is concerned, and he quotes Lord Krishna, and he says, I quote, "The senses, the mind, and the intelligence are the sitting places of lust." And he says, "O Arjun, curb this great symbol of sin, that is lust, by regulating the senses." So the regulation of the senses is what the fire sermon is all about. And Eliot seems, from the title of the fire sermon itself, that the fire could purge humankind of all the hedonistic, pleasures that one gets engulfed in. And this resulted in Eliot feeling a void which he thought could be filled in by his knowledge of Hindu philosophy, indoctrinated by the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. Eliot stood in a kind of symbolic relation to his own time and turned his private grief into public grief at one level, so he could relate his private career to the decline of the Western civilization. So, in a way, he turned to the East, to Hinduism and its ancient mystic belief that strongly discourages indulgence in the senses. Therefore, we find certain characters in the Fire Sermon, like Elizabeth and Leicester, who actually experience a kind of failed transcendence. And it is at this point that we may also refer to what Lord Krishna had said in the Gita, that that if you indulge in the senses, it would burn you like fire. And it is he who said that once you can purge yourself of all these, urges of the physical senses, of the all your hedonistic pleasures, then you may be able to succeed in life. Excuse me. Apart from that, fire is one of the most sacrosanct elements within Hinduism and represents desire and means to eliminate the same. And that is precisely why Eliot took refuge in the Upanishads that articulates the significance of fire as being the mode of ultimate sacrifice. Another Hindu element in the fire sermon in the wasteland is in the act of sex itself, which has the ability to create life. It is a mode of transcendence, but only when the intent is pure. When the mind and soul is pure, it is lust that is forbidden. And in the fire sermon, we can see that it is the typist character, the merchant, Elizabeth and Leicester, who all experience this kind of disillusionment eventually in the end. Now, coming to the second part, just excuse me, lawyer. Lawyer, battery ekdam down ho gayo. Sasun correct kori desu. Now, coming to the second part of the wasteland, which is called death by water. Now, this section is also very important, the concluding section. And death by water describes a land without water and only rocks, sand, dead mountains, and it seems the thunder brings no rain. The thunder seems to be sterile, and Eliot makes his way through this desolate land, which is called the wasteland, and laments the absence of water and imagines the drip drop of water on the rocks and how, people are going to survive without any water. And that is what the second part that I'm going to emphasize on. Now, death by water, among all the 5 sections of the wasteland, is the shortest of the poem's 5 sections. Here, Eliot moves away from the individual to the collective, casting his gaze over Europe and Asia and seeing endless plains and hooded hordes, the apocalyptic vision, the great ancient cities of the Mediterranean and Europe all seem to be unreal. He refers to the violet air as the downfall of Western civilization. And he speaks of Data, Dayadvam, and Daimanta, which refers to the Upanishads and describes the three dictums that God gave to his disciples. So Data means to give, and Dayadvam is to control, and Daimanta is to sympathize with people. And this is a profoundly spiritual moment that he derives from the Upanishads, the communication between God and man, a dialogue between earth and heaven that promises a new beginning. In the backdrop of all this philosophy, yeah, in the backdrop of all this philosophy, we see that Eliot took refuge in the Upanishads and even the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita. The Gita has influenced more on another poem called The Four Quatrains. Death by Water, the final poem, draws a link between Western and Eastern traditions, transporting the reader to the Ganges and the Himalayas, and finally returning to the Thames and even the London Bridge. Now, what we see in this particular section of the poem is that Eliot's tactic throughout the poem is that of mixing and matching and of diversity. So the relevant Upanishad passage which Eliot quotes describes God delivering three groups of travelers. They are the men, the demons, and the gods. The men, the demons, and the gods. And the sound da for men, and for men it is da becomes data, meaning to give, and the more you give, the better for you, and it is meant to curb man's greed. And the second part that we see here is the demons who exist. Daidvam is the dictum of these cruel and sadistic beings. They must show compassion and empathy, gratitude for all the people. And finally, the third one, the gods, must learn control. We have to learn how to control ourselves. That is the damyata, for they are wild and rebellious. And together, these three orders add up to a consistent moral perspective, a kind of composture which helps us to overcome all the trials and tribulations of life. Recalling his earlier allusion to Buddha's fire sermon, Eliot links datta with a description of lust, of the dangers of a moment's surrender, which prudence can never retract. Eliot therefore repeats the Hindu dictum he learned from the Upanishads the three basic dictums that he learned from the Upanishads and which are incorporated in this particular poem, which won him the Nobel Prize, that is Datta, Dayadvam, and Damyata. These three dictums could equip man to fight against the ills, the ills of modern society. And these three words still hold out for Eliot the promise of salvation, which Western civilization failed to give him. And finally, he winds up his poem with three words which actually literally mean peace, that is Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. And these three words is an acknowledgement of that salvation, a kind of blessing of sorts. And the wasteland finally winds up in a note of grace. And this particular poem is very significant even for our turbulent times, even the times of COVID times that we are going through. He tries to alloy both Eastern and Western religious traditions to posit a more universal worldview. And in the end, the poem seems to suggest that the Holy Grail is still within reach, that one can still, hope for a better future among all, in spite of all what is going on. So, eminent writer, critic, philosopher, and ex-president of India, Dr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan had gone through the wasteland, and he records how T.S. Eliot, when asked about the future of our civilization, he says that internecine fighting, killing people, killing one another on the streets is what I could foresee in the coming decades. And this appears to be very true, because when Wasteland was written, it was more than almost a century ago. Eliot is a man who could foresee the future, man who saw the future. And for Eliot, civilization to him appeared to be a crumbling edifice, destined to perish in the flames of war, in the flames of violence. And the tragedy of the human condition imposes an obligation on us to give meaning and significance to life. Now, Eliot's prescription for a new dawn is eventually to be found in the following lines of the fire sermon, when he says, Ganga was sunken and the limp leaves waited for rain, while the black clouds gathered far distant over Himavant. The jungle crouched, humped in silence, then spoke the thunder, Da. These fragments I have showed against my ruins. Why then fit you? Hermoin's mad again, Datta, Dayadvam, Damyata, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. So what we can finally infer in the end is this, as per what Eliot believed, and the influence of the Upanishads on his magnum opus, The Wasteland, is that the Brihadranayaka Upanishad actually alludes to Prajapati, the creator. Prajapati is the creator, and he seems to be talking to his three offsprings. The Prajapati has three offsprings. One of them are the Devatas, the demons, and man. So in the first Brahmana chapter of the chapter 5, all the virtues are brought together under the three das, which are heard in the voice of the thunder. There's a section called What the Thunder Said. And finally, when we come to the last section of the poem, we see a turning point, and the word of the thunder offers a ray of hope penetrating the despair that hangs over the rest of the poem, because The Wasteland, as the title suggests, is a very dark poem. It is about the decay of Western civilization, and the only way that Eliot sees, the only ray of hope he sees is in the Hindu philosophy of the Upanishads, of the Bhagavad Gita. And therefore he winds up the poem. The poem ends with three words: Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. And this is precisely why I would feel that Nobel laureate like T.S. Eliot had to finally take refuge in the Upanishad and the Bhagavad Gita. And he sees everything is dark in the Western civilization, and he looks forward to the East as a ray of hope. That only ray of hope that he sees is that we can finally recover from all the ills and exploits of the world, and only through by inculcating in us the Hindu way of life. And in a letter to another great scholar, mathematician, Bertrand Russell, Eliot had said that The Wasteland is not the best poem, but the last part justifies the whole. So Eliot uses concepts from Sanskrit texts as framework to give shape and support to many ideas that constitute the human psyche, a man on a spiritual journey. So Eliot was on a spiritual journey, and what sparked his interest in Vedic thought is not recorded. But we know for sure that he was a keen observer and a keen student, you could say, one who had done a lot of research on Pali and the metaphysics of Patanjali. And The Wasteland, finally, we could say, reiterates the three cardinal virtues that I have talked about earlier, and that is what he talks about in the end. So finally, I will wind up my lecture today on restraint, charity, and compassion. These are three cardinal points that Eliot tries to emphasize in The Wasteland, that, restraint, charity, and compassion, the three things. That is damyatha. Damyatha is restraint. Datta is charity. You give, the more you give, the greater you become. And dayadvam, that is compassion. So if you have these three things, if you can restrain yourself, if you give yourself, give to others, help others, and if you have compassion, then you will be able to achieve salvation. And the state of mind that follows obedience to these commands of the Lord, as indicated by the blessing in the end, that he says, Shanti, 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 that peace that passes understanding. It is a peace that will go, it will transcend understanding. And that is what we are, we as mankind, I would rather say that, because the whole world is going through so much chaos and violence and turbulent times, apart from the COVID situation. So once we have that kind of charity in our minds, if we have restraint to control our senses, and if we have compassion for the poor, for the neglected, for the have-nots, then I have a strong feeling that the world will be a better place to live in. And this is what T.S. Eliot had envisaged in his magnum opus, The Wasteland. And that is all I would like to say. And I have uh, concluded my talk today with those things, that restraint, charity, and compassion. These are the three cardinal, dictates that one has to follow. And these have been already indoctrinated long, long ago, centuries ago, in the Hindu scriptures, in the Upanishads, and even in the Bhagavad Gita. Thank you so much for listening, and have a good day. Namaskar.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
sir.
Biplab. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. That was a
Uh-huh.
wonderful speech indeed. Got to know
Thank
many
you.
new things. I hope
Uh-huh.
we can connect to you in future as well. Thanks to the
Yes,
viewers also for
definitely.
staying. Yes, sir. Thanks to the viewers also for staying connected with us throughout the entire session. Next Sunday we will be coming live with another new speaker. Until then, stay tuned. So, with that said, we are signing off. Bharat Mata Ki Jai.
Thank you. Bharat Mata ki jai.